The townsfolk of Briar Hollow had a rule unwritten, unspoken, yet carved deep into every glance they cast toward the tree line. No one entered the woods after dusk, not unless they wanted their name whispered alongside those who wandered in and simply never wandered back out. Outsiders never understood the fear. They saw only a forest, quiet, thick with pine, harmless beneath a blanket of fog. But the locals knew better. They had heard the stories about the man who refused to let his family die out, even if it meant bending nature until it snapped. When the reporter first arrived, the air in town shifted. Conversations halted when he passed by. People watched him the way prey watches a rustle in the grass. Yet no one ever told him to stop. They just told him to listen, to pay attention to the silences more than the words. Because the silences held the truth. He didn't believe them at first. Every town had folklore, every hollow had its ghost stories. But the moment he stepped beneath the canopy of Briar Hollow Woods, the world changed. The temperature dropped. The wind died. The moss-covered ground absorbed his footsteps as if it were trying to erase him. Shadows moved without sound, gliding between trunks, studying him with patient, ancient interest. It felt less like a forest and more like a throat, swallowing him whole. Hours in, he found the cabin, or what was left of it. Vines strangled its walls, the roof sagged as though time had grown tired of holding it up, and the front door hung crookedly, creaking with every breath of the wind. But what unnerved him most were the photographs scattered across the floor. Each showed the same man standing beside different women and children, decade after decade, but always with the same face. Eyes cold. Expression fixed. As if the camera had captured something that should never have been seen. By the time he realized the forest had gone silent again, it was too late. A figure stood at the tree line, watching him. Tall. Motionless. Its silhouette stretched unnaturally through the mist. And just before it slipped back into the darkness between the pines, he heard a voice, calm, ragged, impossibly old, whisper his name as though greeting an old friend returning home. The disappearance of the hiker became the spark that reignited every buried fear in Briar Hollow, a town already heavy with superstition and stories people pretended not to believe. He had been an ordinary traveler, passing through, taking photos, asking questions about the woods like hundreds before him. But unlike the others, he went beyond the worn trail. Locals recalled seeing him last near the rusted fence line where the forest thickened to an unnatural density, a place where trees grew so tightly together it felt as though they were conspiring to keep secrets hidden. When he didn't return to his motel that night, the owner assumed he'd simply lost track of time. By morning, worry had begun to creep into whispers. By sundown, those whispers hardened into dread. Search parties ventured in, calling his name, flashing lights between trees that swallowed the beams whole, making them look faint and powerless. Every volunteer returned pale and shaken, claiming the woods felt wrong, their voices echoing back at them in delayed, distorted tones, the undergrowth rustling without any wind. No signs of struggle were found, no belongings left behind, not even a footprint that could confirm which direction he had walked. It was as if the forest had opened and closed around him like a mouth. The hiker's friends posted online, pleading for help, but the digital noise didn't reach the people of Briar Hollow. They relied on older knowledge, old fears passed down through family lines. A few elders muttered that the man should never have been alone in the woods at dusk, especially not during that particular week of the year, when the forest was said to be most restless. One old man at the diner swore he saw someone trailing the hiker from a distance earlier that day, a tall, crooked figure whose face he couldn't fully make out, as if shadow clung unnaturally tight to him. Others insisted they heard an unfamiliar voice calling out long after the search teams returned, a voice that sounded almost like the missing man but flattened, emptied of warmth or panic. The sheriff chalked it up to fear and overactive imagination, but even he hesitated to spend too much time near the tree line after dark. What made the disappearance so unsettling wasn't just that a man had gone missing, it was how cleanly the forest had taken him, how effortlessly it had absorbed him without leaving behind the smallest scrap of evidence. To the townspeople, it confirmed something they had always felt but rarely said aloud, that the woods of Briar Hollow did not simply hide things. They kept them. The discovery of the forbidden family tree began with a seemingly harmless curiosity inside the town's dusty library, a place most locals avoided unless absolutely necessary. The reporter had wandered in on a rainy afternoon, seeking shelter and perhaps a lead that didn't rely on the evasive townspeople. The librarian, a woman with tired eyes and an uncanny habit of glancing toward the windows as though expecting someone to appear, reluctantly handed him access to the archives. These archives consisted of old county records, brittle maps, faded newspaper scraps, and a set of leather-bound genealogical journals belonging to Briar Hollow's earliest families. Buried beneath the oldest volumes, the reporter found a journal wrapped in a cloth that crumbled at his touch. Its cover bore no name, no date, just deep scratches that looked almost intentional. Inside, he discovered a handwritten family tree spanning more than a century. The ink was dark, the handwriting meticulous, but what struck him first was how often the same surname appeared, Crow. At first, it seemed like an ordinary record of births, marriages, and deaths, the kind found in many rural towns where families stayed for generations. But the deeper he read, the more unsettling the pattern became. A man named Elias Crow appeared at the top of the tree, born in the late 1800s. His children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren were listed beneath him, yet something was profoundly wrong. Several branches ended abruptly without death dates, as if the lives had simply been erased or hidden. And then he saw the line that made his breath catch: Elias Crow, age unknown, recorded as the husband of a woman named Marin Crow, his own granddaughter. The connection wasn't a mistake. The entry was written clearly, with no attempt to conceal or justify it. A small note beside her name read, "Chosen by the Bloodline." Further down the page, several births were documented without mothers' names, as if someone had intentionally removed them. The tree no longer looked like a record of a family, it looked like a map of control, a history molded by one man's desire to keep the lineage contained within itself. The reporter sensed that the entries were not only disturbing but incomplete. There were lines crossed out, dates overwritten, and symbols he didn't recognize scattered in the margins. He took the journal to the librarian, but she recoiled the moment she saw it, insisting it should never have surfaced. She refused to answer his questions, whispering only that some histories were dangerous to know. Her fear was real, palpable, and it told him one thing: the story of Elias Crow was not just a myth. It was a truth the entire town had tried and failed to bury. The reporter's arrival in Briar Hollow was not marked by fanfare or welcome but by the kind of cold, assessing stares that made it clear outsiders were rarely invited, let alone wanted. He had come with a sense of purpose sharpened by desperation. His career was fading, his articles losing impact, and his editors hinting that maybe it was time for him to consider another profession. When he stumbled upon an online thread about strange disappearances, rumored curses, and an old man in the woods who supposedly married his own granddaughter, he knew it was the kind of sensational lead that could resurrect his name. The promise of uncovering a truth twisted enough to fascinate thousands pushed him toward the forgotten town nestled between ridges of dense, brooding forest. But what he didn't anticipate was how quickly the atmosphere would shift the moment he stepped out of his car. The air felt strangely heavy, as if the town itself were exhaling years of tension in his direction. The gas station attendant eyed him with a mixture of suspicion and pity, offering short answers and nervous glances toward the tree line. People walking the sidewalks veered away from him, clutching their jackets tighter, as if proximity alone might drag them into the trouble they believed he was destined to find. Even the sheriff, a broad-shouldered man with tired wrinkles carved deep into his face, offered only a curt nod when the reporter introduced himself. The message was clear: Briar Hollow did not appreciate strangers who came asking questions, especially not those brave or foolish enough to mention the woods. Despite the resistance, the reporter continued his inquiries. He visited the diner, hoping conversation flowed more freely over coffee and pie, but instead he found silence heavy enough to press against his skin. Every attempt he made to bring up the missing hiker or the name Elias Crow was met with stiff postures and quick changes of subject. It wasn't just fear, it was collective denial, an entire town actively smothering a truth they no longer dared acknowledge aloud. Yet he also sensed a quiet desperation in their avoidance, as if they wanted him to uncover the truth even as they tried to push him away. What kept him moving forward was a flicker of intuition, a feeling that the story waiting beyond the shadows was bigger than any rumor he had read online. Something ancient seemed to seep from the soil here, something that shaped the people's behavior and dictated their silence. As night approached and the wind curled through the streets like a warning whispered in a forgotten language, the reporter realized that he had not simply arrived to investigate a mystery. He had stepped into the center of one, and Briar Hollow was quietly watching to see whether he would survive learning the truth. The deeper the reporter pushed into his questions, the more fiercely the locals pushed back, not with open hostility but with a silent panic that clung to every word they didn't say. It began subtly during his second day in town, when he returned to the diner hoping to coax a conversation out of someone who had avoided his questions the night before. Instead, he found the same group of regulars sitting at the counter, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on their mugs as if the swirling coffee could shield them. When he mentioned the missing hiker again, a woman in a faded floral apron whispered to him under her breath that he should leave while he still could. Before he could press further, she turned away abruptly, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the counter. It wasn't defiance he saw in her expression, but fear so old and familiar it had settled deep in her bones. The sheriff offered no comfort either. When the reporter approached him outside the station, hoping to gather an official account of past disappearances or strange sightings, the sheriff's jaw tightened. He spoke in short, clipped sentences, insisting that the woods were dangerous because of wildlife, unstable terrain, and unpredictable weather. Yet his eyes betrayed him, shifting toward the tree line as though expecting it to move. When the reporter brought up Elias Crow by name, the sheriff's face went pale, and he ended the conversation immediately, muttering that some stories had already cost the town too much. The most revealing moment came later that afternoon when an elderly man stopped the reporter outside the general store. The man's posture was slightly bent, his eyes cloudy with age but sharp with dread. He warned the reporter never to speak Elias's name aloud again, claiming that the woods listened, that they remembered, and that the man who once ruled them had a way of hearing his own name no matter how softly it was spoken. When the reporter asked who Elias really was, the old man's breath shuddered, and he whispered that Elias had broken a rule older than the town itself, a rule nature punished without mercy. Blood was never meant to fold back into itself. Before the reporter could ask anything else, the old man shuffled away, casting nervous glances behind him as though expecting someone or something to follow. The more resistance he met, the clearer it became that the town's silence wasn't rooted in superstition alone. It was rooted in experience. Every warning felt like a plea disguised as caution, as if the townspeople believed that by pushing him away, they might prevent history from repeating itself. And yet their avoidance carried a strange tension, a quiet guilt that suggested they knew the truth was already stirring in the woods, and the reporter's presence had only awakened something they had tried for decades to keep asleep. The cabin revealed itself the way a predator reveals teeth, slowly, quietly, and only when it decided the moment was right. The reporter had been hiking deeper into the woods than he intended, guided only by a thin trail carved by either animals or long-forgotten footsteps. The forest felt different that day, as if the trees were subtly shifting their positions, narrowing the route behind him and funneling him toward a destination they had chosen long before he entered their shadows. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something metallic. Birds had vanished. Even the rustling of leaves seemed to pause, creating an unnatural silence that pressed against his ears. It was within this unsettling stillness that he saw a sliver of structure peeking through a curtain of tangled vines. At first, the cabin looked abandoned, more like a rotting memory than a building. Trees leaned over it protectively, their branches draping across the roof like skeletal fingers. Moss crawled over the wooden planks, and the windows were so clouded they resembled cataracts. It was the kind of place one might overlook entirely, swallowed by the forest's determination to reclaim what human hands once built. Yet the reporter felt an inexplicable pull, as though something inside the cabin had been waiting for him, whispering through the cracks in the wood. As he approached, the ground softened beneath his feet, and he realized the forest floor around the cabin was unusually disturbed, as if the earth had been churned recently despite the structure's apparent age. The front door hung crookedly from its hinges, swaying ever so slightly even without a breeze. When he pushed it open, the door released a slow groan that sounded almost like a warning. Inside, dust coated everything, but not evenly. Certain areas, particularly the table, a chair, and the narrow path leading deeper into the cabin, looked as though someone or something had been moving through the space. The interior smelled of decay mixed with something strangely sweet, a scent that turned his stomach yet compelled him to continue. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars filled with murky liquid, some containing unidentifiable shapes suspended within. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight, but the sound seemed swallowed by the oppressive quiet. Then something caught his eye, a series of photographs tacked to the far wall. They were faded, damaged by time, but clear enough to show a pattern. The same man appeared in each photo, standing beside different people in different eras, yet his face never changed. His expression was cold, almost lifeless, and his presence in every decade felt like a shadow passing through time without ever aging. The reporter felt a chill crawl up his spine as he realized the cabin wasn't simply abandoned. It was preserved. Hidden intentionally. It was a place meant not to be found, tucked away in the woods as though the forest itself conspired to keep it secret. And now, by uncovering it, he had crossed a threshold he could no longer step back from. The longer the reporter stayed inside the cabin, the stronger the sensation grew that time didn't behave properly within those walls. Dust settled differently, shadows clung to corners with unnatural density, and the air felt thick enough to slow his breathing. As he combed through the clutter, he noticed objects that had no logical reason to exist together: a rusted lantern beside a modern plastic comb, a newspaper from the 1920s layered over a flyer dated barely 5 years ago, photographs from different eras stacked as though they had been taken days apart. None of this disturbed him as deeply as the discovery he made near the back room, where the oppressive silence was broken only by his cautious footsteps. The room contained a makeshift study, with a desk surrounded by shelves heavy with handwritten journals, brittle files, and glass jars coated in grime. It was there he found a small metal tin, tucked beneath a stack of old postcards. When he opened it, his breath hitched. Inside were carefully preserved photographs dating back more than a century, each one depicting the same man, Elias Crow, standing stiffly beside various members of the Crow family. In photos labeled 1902, 1920, 1947, 1963, and even one eerily dated 1998, Elias looked exactly the same. No wrinkles deepened, no posture weakened, no signs of the slow erosion of age touched him. He wore different clothes in each decade, stood in different settings, yet his expression and features remained disturbingly unchanged, like a portrait copied repeatedly across time. A chill moved through the reporter as he compared the images side by side. The lighting varied, the backgrounds shifted, and the people around Elias visibly aged or changed across generations, yet he remained frozen in a state of agelessness that defied explanation. It wasn't simply that he didn't appear older, there was a stillness in his eyes that suggested something far more unnatural. As if time itself refused to touch him. Near the bottom of the tin, the reporter found a photograph so recent that the vibrant color hadn't yet faded. It showed Elias standing alone in a clearing he recognized immediately, the very woods he had walked through earlier that day. The timestamp was less than 5 years old. That was impossible, yet the evidence lay in his trembling hands. Searching for rationality, he flipped through the journals on the shelf. Many pages were missing, torn out violently. Others were filled with cryptic symbols and fragmented notes about lineage, purity, and rituals meant to bind the blood to the root. Several entries suggested experiments, attempts to maintain or reclaim youth by restricting the bloodline. The words felt cold, clinical, and deeply obsessive. As he read, the reporter felt the weight of realization settle heavily on him. This wasn't just a story of a man who married within his own family. It was the story of someone who had found a way to stretch his existence unnaturally far beyond its natural limits. The cabin no longer felt abandoned. It felt inhabited by a presence that lingered even when unseen, as if Elias himself hovered just beyond the edges of reality, watching, waiting, and somehow surviving the erosion of time in a way no human should. The first night the reporter spent in Briar Hollow after discovering Elias's photographs felt different from the others, as if something unseen had begun following him the moment he stepped out of the cabin. The forest silence clung to him long after he returned to town, lingering like a residue that refused to wash away. Even in the safety of his motel room, the air felt heavier, as though the walls were holding their breath. He tried to distract himself by reviewing his notes and organizing the disturbing evidence he had gathered, but his concentration fractured every few minutes. A subtle sound kept pulling his attention away, not loud enough to startle, but persistent enough to crawl beneath his skin. At first, he dismissed it as the usual settling of an older building, the wind pushing against the siding, or the occasional footsteps from rooms down the hall. But after midnight, when the town fell into its deepest sleep, the noises became disturbingly distinct. They were whispers. Soft, faint, but undeniably human. He pressed his ear to the wall, expecting muffled conversation from a neighboring room, yet the whispering did not come from beside him. It came from the window. When he approached the glass, he saw nothing but the dark stretch of the motel parking lot, illuminated dimly by a flickering streetlight. Still, the voices persisted, weaving through the air like threads of breath carried on a wind he couldn't feel. They were too fragmented to understand, but the tone was unmistakable, desperate, urgent, and somehow familiar, almost as if they belonged to people trying to warn him of something he couldn't yet see. The whispers followed him the next day into the woods. They drifted between the trees, arriving in strange intervals, sometimes distant, sometimes so close they grazed the back of his neck like a chill. He stopped repeatedly, turning in circles, searching for any sign of movement, but the forest always stood still, watching. At one point, the whispers grew sharper, layered with emotion he couldn't decipher. When he called out, demanding whoever was there to show themselves, the woods answered only with a slow, eerie echo of his own voice, repeating his words in a tone that sounded hollow and forced. Later, as dusk approached, the whispers changed. They no longer sounded warning or distressed. They sounded curious, almost playful, as though the forest itself were learning the shape of his name and testing how it felt slipping through its branches. The most unsettling moment came when one voice, clear, cold, and unmistakably familiar from the photographs, spoke his name exactly as Elias Crow might have whispered it. Not shouted. Not threatened. Just softly spoken, like a greeting meant for someone long expected. He tried convincing himself that exhaustion or tension was distorting his senses, but deep inside he knew the truth. The whispers weren't imagined. They weren't echoes or tricks of the wind. Something in the woods had noticed him, recognized him, and begun calling to him with a patience that felt ancient. The more he listened, the more he realized these voices were not merely sounds in the forest, they were invitations. The first time the reporter saw the human-shaped figure, it was almost easy to dismiss it as a trick of the forest, a shadow, a tree stump, a branch shaped just wrong enough to deceive tired eyes. But the forest had grown far too quiet, and the air had become unnaturally still, as if everything around him was holding its breath. He had been following a narrow, overgrown trail when he felt a sudden pressure behind him, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. He stopped walking. The forest didn't move. Even the usual rustle of small animals was absent, replaced by a silence so deep it felt like a presence of its own. He turned, slowly, expecting emptiness, but instead he saw something partially hidden behind a tree trunk. Humanoid, tall but with proportions that seemed subtly wrong. The limbs appeared too long, the posture too rigid, as though whoever, or whatever, it was had only recently learned how to mimic a human shape. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, almost curious, almost expectant. For a long moment, neither he nor the figure moved. The reporter's heart pounded so hard he felt it in his throat, but in the stillness nothing happened. When he managed to lift his flashlight, the beam trembled in his shaking hand. Light washed across the tree, across a patch of moss, and then across the figure itself. The reaction was instant. The shape flinched back with a speed that made the reporter stumble. It retreated behind the tree with such fluid motion that it wasn't just fast, it was silent, impossibly silent. No snapping twigs, no crushed leaves, not even the soft thud of feet pushing off the ground. It moved like breath escaping into the night, dissolving rather than stepping away. For a few seconds, the reporter couldn't bring himself to breathe. His rational mind tried to explain it. An animal, an illusion, exhaustion. But none of those explanations aligned with what he had just seen. The figure had stood perfectly still, like a person waiting. Its shape had been unmistakably human, yet the speed with which it vanished belonged to no human he had ever known. He considered turning back, but something inside the woods pulsed with an energy that felt both threatening and beckoning. As he inched forward, the forest seemed to widen, giving him space as though it approved of his decision to continue. He kept scanning between the trees, half expecting the figure to reappear. Every shadow felt deeper now, every movement in the corner of his eye more deliberate. Once, he thought he caught the outline of the figure again far ahead, its silhouette perched unnaturally high in the crook of a tree, watching him with eerie stillness. But when he blinked, it was gone. By the time he reached the clearing, his nerves were frayed and his breath unsteady. He knew what he had seen wasn't an illusion. Something was roaming these woods, something shaped like a man but not bound by human limitations. And worse, it wasn't avoiding him out of fear. It was studying him, learning him, as though waiting for the exact moment it wanted him to see it again. The path that led the reporter to the old graveyard was not one he consciously chose. It felt instead like the woods were guiding him, nudging him through narrow gaps between trees, drawing him along faint traces of trails that looked more like scars in the earth than actual pathways. The air grew colder the deeper he went, carrying a dampness that clung to his skin and made every breath feel heavy. When he reached a small rise in the land, he noticed the forest thinning slightly ahead, revealing a clearing he hadn't seen on any map or aerial image. Something about the space felt wrong, too open in a forest that otherwise pressed in from all sides. As he stepped into the clearing, his foot brushed against something hard beneath a layer of dead leaves. Brushing them aside, he found a cracked stone marker half sunken into the soil. Then another. And another. It wasn't a cemetery built with intention. It was more like graves had been placed here over decades, each one carved with shaky hands and little care for alignment. Most headstones were crooked, leaning like they were trying to escape the earth they were meant to mark. The names etched into the stones made the reporter's blood run cold. Crow. 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 Nearly every grave belonged to someone in the same family line. Some stones were worn smooth, the dates barely visible, consumed by moss and time. Others looked disturbingly fresh, their carvings sharp and clean as though someone had made them in the past few years. He knelt in front of one of the older graves and brushed off the dirt. The name belonged to Marin Crow, the same granddaughter mentioned in the genealogical records. Her date of death aligned roughly with the time her entry in the journal abruptly stopped. Moving deeper into the clearing, he found smaller stones, many unmarked, some only bearing a single initial as if their identities were never meant to be fully acknowledged. The overwhelming sense of secrecy clung to every inch of the ground. But it was the grave at the far end of the clearing that unsettled him most. It was larger, more recent, the soil around it still darker than the rest, turned over as though it had been dug up or refilled not long ago. The sight sent a cold pulse down his spine. Someone had been here. Recently. Someone had disturbed the grave of a crow. He crouched beside it, his fingers brushing the loose soil. It was softer than it should be, lightly packed, as if whoever filled it had done so in haste. There was no marker, no name, no date, just a blank mound of earth holding a presence he could almost feel humming beneath the surface. As he leaned closer, he noticed faint impressions around the grave, marks that could have been footprints, but distorted in a way that made them impossible to identify. They were too long, the spacing too uneven, as if the figure that moved here didn't walk like a person but shifted its weight in a way that defied anatomy. Standing again, he felt the forest close in, as though the trees were listening to his every breath. A wave of unease spread through him, heavy and instinctive. This wasn't merely a burial site. It was a ledger of a family's broken history, a place where the past had not been laid to rest but preserved, perhaps even protected. And the freshly disturbed grave suggested that whatever haunted the woods wasn't only alive. It was active. Watching. And closer than he had realized. The moment Elias revealed himself, the forest seemed to shift around the reporter, as if every tree, branch, and shadow leaned in closer to witness the encounter. It began subtly, with a movement at the edge of his vision, a figure stepping out from behind the gnarled roots of an ancient oak, tall and impossibly straight, the air around him cold enough to make the reporter's breath fog. There was no sound at first, no snapping twigs or rustling leaves, only the presence of a man whose eyes seemed to pierce through the dense darkness. Time itself felt fractured. For a moment, the reporter thought he was looking at one of the photographs he had found in the cabin, the same unmoving, unchanging face staring back at him. But this was no image. This was living, breathing, or something like it. Elias's hair, long and streaked with grey, framed a face that bore the weight of centuries. His features were sharp yet oddly softened, the kind of face that could belong to a man but also hint at something beyond humanity. His eyes held an unsettling clarity, the kind that made the reporter feel stripped bare, every thought and fear laid open. When Elias finally spoke, his voice was calm, slow, and deliberate, carrying a resonance that seemed to echo in the air itself. It wasn't loud, yet every word cut through the oppressive silence with precision. "I've been waiting," he said, as though the reporter had always been part of a plan set into motion long before the first footprints were laid in the woods. The forest, usually a chaotic tangle of sound and movement, fell into an unnatural stillness. Even the wind died. The only motion was Elias himself, stepping forward with deliberate slowness, his gaze never leaving the reporter. There was an immediacy to his presence that both drew the reporter closer and froze him in place, as if the pull of centuries of obsession radiated from the man in waves strong enough to bend the very air. Every detail became vivid, the subtle sway of his coat, the faint metallic scent clinging to the fabric, the strange rhythm of his breathing that didn't seem entirely human. As the reporter struggled to find words, Elias raised a hand, not threateningly, but with the same calm authority one might reserve for addressing a child. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition, a quiet reminder that he had survived generations by bending reality to his will. The very soil beneath their feet seemed charged, humming with life yet touched by death, and for the first time, the reporter understood the depth of what the photographs had shown him. Elias Crow was no ordinary man. He was a figure preserved and perfected by centuries of obsession, cruelty, and unnatural design, a presence that the forest had hidden yet nurtured. And now, finally, he had chosen to step into the clearing, to face the intruder who had dared follow the traces of a story meant to remain buried. The weight of that realization pressed on the reporter with a force he had never experienced, a sense that nothing in the world beyond the forest mattered, and that whatever came next would define not just the story he sought, but his very survival.